The scissors trembled in Maria Rodriguez's weathered hands as she stared at her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror of their one-bedroom apartment. 23 inches of thick, lustrous black hair cascaded down her back, hair that had been her pride since childhood, hair that strangers stopped her on the street to compliment, hair that her late husband Carlos used to run his fingers through while whispering that it was more beautiful than silk. But tonight, it wasn't about beauty. Tonight, it was about survival. Her 4 children slept fitfully in the next room. 8-year-old Sofia curled around 5-year-old Miguel, while 3-year-old twins Emma and Lise shared a mattress on the floor. They'd gone to bed hungry again, their stomachs growling softly in the darkness. The electricity had been shut off 3 days ago, and the final eviction notice was taped to their door, giving them 48 hours to come up with $2,847 or lose the only home her children had ever known. Maria had found the hair buyer's advertisement online at the public library. Premium hair wanted, cash paid immediately. Long, healthy hair only. What she didn't know was that 200 miles away, a man named Jonathan Hayes was about to make a decision that would change her life forever. But that discovery was still days away, hidden behind a series of events that would test Maria's resolve and reveal the extraordinary power of human compassion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maria Elena Rodriguez had never imagined that at 28 years old, she would be weighing the value of her hair against her children's next meal. But here she stood in the flickering candlelight of their bathroom, holding the scissors she'd borrowed from their neighbor Mrs. Chun, trying to summon the courage to cut away the last vestige of the woman she used to be. 3 months ago, Maria had been a different person entirely. She'd worked the early morning shift at Sunrise Diner on Route 40, serving coffee and eggs to truckers and commuters while her children slept. Carlos, her husband of 9 years, had been employed at Morrison Construction, bringing home steady wages that kept their family comfortable, if not wealthy. They'd had plans, saving for a house with a yard where the children could play, maybe taking a vacation to Disneyland when the twins were old enough to remember it. Then came the accident. Carlos had been working on a high-rise project in downtown Phoenix when the scaffolding collapsed. The doctors at St. Joseph's Hospital had done everything they could, but internal injuries from the 3-story fall had been too severe. He'd lived for 6 days, long enough to hold each of his children and whisper to Maria that she was the strongest person he'd ever known, that she would find a way to take care of their family. "You're stronger than you think, mi amor," he'd said, his voice barely audible over the beeping machines. "Promise me you won't give up." Maria had promised, but strength felt like a foreign concept now as she faced the stark reality of single motherhood with no safety net. Carlos hadn't had life insurance. They'd always planned to get it next year when money wasn't so tight. The construction company offered a small settlement that covered the funeral expenses and 2 months of rent. But after that, Maria was on her own. The morning shift at Sunrise Diner paid $11.50 an hour plus tips, which might have been manageable if Maria could have kept working full-time. But childcare for 4 children, especially the 3-year-old twins, cost more than she made. She'd tried working the night shift instead, leaving Sofia, her 8-year-old, to watch her siblings while she served dinner and late-night coffee to a rougher crowd that left smaller tips and made comments that made her skin crawl. But 8-year-old children, no matter how mature, shouldn't be responsible for toddlers and kindergartners. Maria knew this, just as she knew that neighbors had started making concerned calls to Child Protective Services about the children being unsupervised. She'd received a visit from a social worker named Janet Mills, a kind but overworked woman, who'd made it clear that Maria needed to find a sustainable childcare solution or risk having her children placed in foster care. "I can see you're trying your best, Mrs. Rodriguez," Janet had said, her clipboard balanced on her knee as she surveyed their small apartment. "But these children need supervision and stability. I'm going to give you 60 days to demonstrate that you can provide both." 60 days. That had been 47 days ago, and Maria was no closer to a solution. If anything, things had gotten worse. The rent on their one-bedroom apartment was $1,200 a month, reasonable for Phoenix, but impossible on Maria's reduced income. She'd fallen behind in February, caught up in March with help from a church charity, then fallen behind again in April when Miguel had gotten sick and she'd missed a week of work. The twins had been constantly battling ear infections, requiring doctor visits and antibiotics that ate up what little savings she had left. Maria had applied for every assistance program she could find. Food stamps helped with groceries, but the waiting list for housing assistance was 18 months long. Medicaid covered basic medical care for the children, but didn't help with the immediate crisis of keeping a roof over their heads. She'd swallowed her pride and called her sister Elena in California, but Elena's own family was struggling with her husband's recent job loss. "I wish I could help, Mia," Elena had said, her voice heavy with guilt. "But David's been out of work for 3 months. We're barely hanging on ourselves." Maria's parents had died in a car accident when she was 19, and Carlos's family had never approved of their marriage. His mother had made it clear at the funeral that she blamed Maria for not preventing the accident somehow, as if love could have made scaffolding stronger or given Carlos the reflexes to dodge falling steel. So Maria faced each day alone, making impossible choices between necessities: heat or groceries, medicine for the twins or gas for the 15-year-old Honda that was her only means of getting to work. New shoes for Sophia, whose toes were curling in her outgrown sneakers, or keeping the electricity on for another month. She'd tried everything she could think of to increase their income. She'd offered to clean houses on her days off, but most clients wanted someone who could work during business hours when they weren't home. She'd attempted to sell items on Facebook Marketplace, but their few possessions of any value had already been pawned months ago. Carlos's tools, his watch, her wedding ring, everything that could be converted to cash had already been sacrificed to the relentless arithmetic of poverty. The breaking point had come 3 days ago when she'd returned from her shift at the diner to find the electricity cut off and the final eviction notice taped to their door. The notice was formal and cold, giving her 48 hours to pay the full amount owed or face removal by the sheriff's department. Maria had sat on the floor of their darkened apartment, surrounded by her sleeping children, and tried to calculate any possible solution. She'd called the landlord, Mr. Patterson, and begged for an extension, but he'd heard it all before. "Look, Maria, I like you and the kids," he'd said, not unkindly, "but I've got my own bills to pay. The bank doesn't care that you're a widow with kids. If you can't pay, I need tenants who can." She'd spent hours that night searching online at the public library for emergency assistance programs, last-minute loans, anything that could bridge the gap. That's when she'd found the advertisement that would change everything: premium hair buyers, top dollar for long, healthy hair, immediate cash payment, no questions asked. The website showed photos of women with hair like hers, long, thick, undamaged by chemicals or heat styling. The prices listed made Maria's heart race. Hair her length and quality could bring anywhere from $800 to $1,500, depending on the buyer and the current market demand. It wasn't enough to solve all their problems, but it might buy them time to find a more permanent solution. Maria had researched hair buying extensively over the past 2 days, learning about the industry that turned human hair into wigs, extensions, and hairpieces. There was apparently a thriving market for virgin hair, hair that had never been chemically processed or damaged. Her hair qualified. It was naturally black, had never been dyed or permed, and hung in thick waves to just above her waist. The irony wasn't lost on her that the thing she'd always considered her vanity The part of her appearance that drew compliments and made her feel beautiful might be the key to keeping her family together. She'd made appointments with 3 different hair buyers in Phoenix, hoping to get the best possible price. The first, a salon that specialized in custom wigs, had offered $600. The second, a wholesaler who shipped hair to manufacturers across the country, had quoted $850, but it was the third buyer, a small shop called Golden Strands in an upscale neighborhood, that had given her the quote that made the decision easier: $1,200 for her full length of hair, paid in cash immediately upon cutting. $1,200 would cover the rent, get the electricity turned back on, and leave enough for groceries and gas for the rest of the month. It would buy her time to figure out a longer-term solution, maybe find a second job or qualify for additional assistance. But as Maria stood in the bathroom, scissors poised at the nape of her neck, she found herself hesitating. This hair carried memories. Carlos had loved to braid it while they watched television in the evenings. Sophia often asked Maria to teach her to style long hair like Mama's princess hair. The twins liked to play with it when they were upset, running the silky strands through their small fingers like a security blanket. More than that, though, cutting her hair felt like surrendering the last piece of the woman she'd been before tragedy reshaped her life. The Maria who'd had dreams and plans, who'd felt beautiful and desired, who'd believed that hard work and love were enough to protect her family from hardship, but that Maria had been naive. This Maria, the one standing in a dark bathroom preparing to sell her hair to keep her children housed and fed, understood that survival sometimes required sacrificing the things that seemed important when security was taken for granted. The twins had cried themselves to sleep tonight, too young to understand why there was no food in the refrigerator, but old enough to feel the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. Sophia had offered to give up her school lunch money to help buy groceries, breaking Maria's heart with her 8-year-old attempt to solve adult problems. Miguel had been asking why they couldn't just turn the lights on, his 5-year-old logic, unable to comprehend why electricity cost money. These were the thoughts that finally gave Maria the strength to position the scissors and make the first cut. The sound of the blades closing through her hair was louder than she'd expected, a crisp snip that seemed to echo in the small bathroom. The first section fell to the floor like a dark waterfall, and Maria felt an immediate sense of loss so profound it took her breath away. But she didn't stop. Working methodically, she cut section after section, watching years of growth fall to the tile floor around her feet. With each cut, she whispered a small prayer for strength, for her children's future, for the hope that this sacrifice would be worth it. When she was finished, Maria's reflection showed a stranger. Her hair now fell just below her chin, revealing the sharp angles of her face that had been softened by longer hair. She looked older, more severe, but also somehow stronger. The woman in the mirror looked like someone who would do whatever was necessary to protect her children. Maria carefully gathered the cut hair, following the instructions she'd received from Golden Strands. The hair needed to be secured in a ponytail before cutting to maintain its value, then stored in a plastic bag to prevent tangling. She had 23 inches of premium hair that would soon become someone else's wig or extensions, but tonight it was her children's salvation. She spent the rest of the night in the living room, holding the bag of hair and trying to reconcile the woman she'd been with the woman she was becoming. Outside, Phoenix slept peacefully, unaware that in a small apartment in a struggling neighborhood, a mother had made a sacrifice that would ripple through more lives than she could possibly imagine. As dawn broke through their thin curtains, Maria prepared to wake her children and explain why Mama looked different. She would tell them she'd gotten a haircut, nothing more. They were too young to understand the weight of the choice she'd made. Too innocent to know that sometimes love meant giving up the things that made you feel like yourself. But what Maria didn't know as she prepared for another day of survival was that her story was about to intersect with that of a man who understood sacrifice from an entirely different perspective. Jonathan Hayes, heir to a real estate fortune, built over 3 generations, was about to learn that true wealth had nothing to do with the numbers in his bank account. The wheels of change were already in motion, set in motion by a simple act of maternal desperation that would prove to be anything but simple in its consequences. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 300 miles away in the hills of Malibu, Jonathan Hayes stood in his glass-walled office overlooking the Pacific Ocean, completely unaware that his life was about to collide with that of a desperate mother in Phoenix. At 34, Jonathan was everything Maria Rodriguez was not: wealthy beyond imagination, insulated from financial worry, and haunted by an entirely different kind of emptiness. The Hayes family fortune had been built over 3 generations, starting with his grandfather Samuel Hayes, who'd purchased distressed properties during the Great Depression and transformed them into California's most exclusive residential developments. Jonathan's father, Richard Hayes, had expanded the empire into commercial real estate, luxury resorts, and eventually tech investments that had multiplied their wealth exponentially. But wealth, Jonathan had learned, was both a blessing and a curse that isolated him from the authentic human connections he desperately craved. That morning, Jonathan sat across from his board of directors in the mahogany-paneled conference room of Hayes Development Corporation, listening to quarterly reports that should have filled him with satisfaction. The company was thriving. Their latest resort development in Cibio San Lucas was booked solid for the next 18 months. Their residential projects in Austin and Denver had waiting lists of wealthy buyers, and their tech investments were outperforming market projections by 40%. "Outstanding quarter, Jonathan," said Margaret Chen, the company's chief financial officer, closing her leather portfolio with a satisfied smile. "At this rate, we'll exceed last year's profits by 60%. Jonathan nodded appropriately, made the expected comments about market positioning and future opportunities, but his mind was elsewhere. These numbers, impressive as they were, felt increasingly meaningless. He'd inherited a machine that generated wealth almost automatically, requiring little more from him than occasional strategic decisions and public appearances at charity galas. The meeting concluded with handshakes and congratulations, leaving Jonathan alone in the conference room with its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the California coastline. He could see his neighbors' estates scattered across the hills, fellow multimillionaires who lived in the same insulated bubble of privilege that had defined his entire adult life. Jonathan's personal assistant, Patricia Williams, appeared in the doorway with his afternoon schedule. "You have the architectural review for the Portland project at 2, the conference call with the Miami investors at 3:30, and don't forget, you're scheduled to speak at the Children's Hospital fundraiser tonight." The Children's Hospital fundraiser. Jonathan had been supporting the hospital for years, writing substantial checks and making speeches about the importance of pediatric care. But lately, these events felt performative, a way for wealthy people to feel good about themselves while maintaining comfortable distance from the actual problems they claimed to care about. "Patricia," Jonathan said, still staring out at the ocean, "cancel everything after 3. I need some time to think." Patricia looked surprised. In the 5 years she'd worked for Jonathan, he'd never canceled meetings without a specific reason. "Are you feeling all right? Should I reschedule the fundraiser as well?" "No, I'll still attend the fundraiser. But I want to drive myself tonight. And Patricia?" He turned to face her. "Find out more about the hospital's emergency assistance programs. I want to understand where the money actually goes, not just the glossy brochures they show at donor events." After Patricia left, Jonathan found himself thinking about a conversation he'd had with his father just before Richard's death from cancer 2 years earlier. They'd been sitting in the hospital room, ironically, the same children's hospital, where Jonathan would speak that evening, watching children in the oncology ward through the window. "You know what I regret most?" Richard had said, his voice weakened by chemotherapy, but his mind still sharp. "I spent so much time building wealth that I forgot to build purpose. Money gives you options, son, but it doesn't give you meaning. You have to find that yourself." At the time, Jonathan had assumed his father was simply being philosophical in the face of mortality. But 2 years later, those words echoed in his mind daily. He'd inherited everything: the company, the properties, the investments, the social connections, but he'd also inherited a profound sense of disconnection from anything that felt genuinely meaningful. Jonathan's personal life reflected this emptiness. He'd been engaged twice, both times to women from similar backgrounds who understood the expectations that came with wealth, but seemed more interested in the Hayes name than in Jonathan himself. His social circle consisted primarily of business associates and fellow heirs to family fortunes, people who spoke the same language of privilege, but rarely engaged in conversations that went beyond market trends and vacation destinations. He'd tried various forms of philanthropy, serving on boards and writing checks to worthy causes, but the process felt sterile and impersonal. He was contributing money, something he had in abundance, but not contributing himself in any meaningful way. That afternoon, instead of attending meetings, Jonathan drove his Tesla down Pacific Coast Highway toward Los Angeles, needing movement and space to think. He'd made this drive countless times, but today he found himself noticing details that had previously escaped his attention. The homeless encampments beneath freeway overpasses, the contrast between the gleaming office buildings of Santa Monica and the rundown neighborhoods just blocks away, the invisible line between the world he inhabited and the world where real struggle occurred. As evening approached, Jonathan returned to his Malibu estate to prepare for the fundraiser. The house, an architectural marvel of glass and steel cantilevered over the cliffs, felt more like a museum than a home. He'd inherited it from his father, along with the staff who maintained it, but he'd never felt truly comfortable in spaces so grand they seemed to dwarf human occupancy. His walk-in closet was larger than many people's apartments, filled with custom suits and designer clothes he wore to events where appearance mattered more than authenticity. As he dressed for the evening, Jonathan caught his reflection in the full-length mirror and saw what everyone else saw: a successful, handsome businessman who appeared to have everything anyone could want. But appearances, he'd learned, were often elaborate deceptions. The Children's Hospital fundraiser was held at the Beverly Hills Hotel, in the same crystal ballroom where similar events had been held for decades. Jonathan arrived to find the usual crowd: entertainment industry executives, tech entrepreneurs, real estate magnates, and their perfectly dressed spouses. Everyone was affluent, everyone was articulate, and everyone was committed to raising money for sick children while maintaining careful distance from the actual suffering that made their charity necessary. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the hospital's chief of pediatrics, gave the evening's keynote address, sharing statistics about childhood cancer rates and treatment success stories. She was passionate and knowledgeable, but Jonathan found himself wondering about the children who weren't success stories, the families who couldn't afford the best care, the parents who faced impossible choices between medical bills and basic necessities. During the cocktail reception, Jonathan approached Dr. Martinez, introducing himself as one of the evening's major donors. "Dr. Martinez, I'm curious about your emergency assistance programs. How do you help families who can't afford treatment?" Dr. Martinez's expression shifted from the polished fundraiser smile to something more genuine. "That's actually where we see the most desperate need, Mr. Hayes. We have a family assistance fund, but it's chronically underfunded. We regularly see parents who are forced to choose between their child's medical care and keeping their family housed and fed." "What kinds of situations?" Jonathan asked, genuinely interested. "Just last week, we had a mother bring in her child with a severe asthma attack. The boy needed immediate treatment, but she was hesitant to authorize anything beyond basic emergency care because she knew she couldn't pay for it. She was a single parent, working 2 jobs, but still couldn't afford health insurance that covered her son's chronic condition. The conversation continued, with Dr. Martinez sharing story after story of families in crisis. Parents who slept in hospital parking lots because they couldn't afford hotels while their children received treatment. Families who were forced to choose between gas money to get to medical appointments and groceries for their other children. Single mothers who worked multiple jobs but still couldn't bridge the gap between survival and stability. These weren't abstract statistics or carefully crafted narratives designed to encourage donations. These were real people facing impossible choices, and their stories resonated with Jonathan in ways that surprised him. Dr. Martinez, Jonathan said as the evening wound down, "I'd like to learn more about these families. Not for a tax deduction or a press release, but because I want to understand how to help in ways that actually matter." Dr. Martinez studied him for a moment, perhaps recognizing something beyond the typical wealthy donor's curiosity. "There's a caseworker named Linda Morrison who handles our most difficult family situations. She could give you a better sense of the day-to-day challenges these families face." Jonathan left the fundraiser with Linda, Morrison's contact information, and a growing sense that his comfortable life was about to be disrupted in necessary ways. He'd written another substantial check to the hospital, but more importantly, he'd committed to something that felt more personal and more risky. The drive back to Malibu took him through neighborhoods he'd never noticed before, past apartment complexes and strip malls that existed in the same geographic area as his world, but felt like entirely different universes. He found himself wondering about the people behind the lighted windows, what struggles they faced, what sacrifices they made, what dreams they held onto despite circumstances that seemed designed to crush hope. That night, Jonathan sat on his terrace overlooking the Pacific, surrounded by luxury but feeling more alone than ever. He'd spent his entire adult life accumulating wealth and status, but he'd somehow missed the connections and purpose that made life meaningful. His father's deathbed words echoed in his mind. "Money gives you options, but it doesn't give you meaning." Meanwhile, 300 miles away in Phoenix, Maria Rodriguez was preparing for her own sleepless night, holding a bag of her cut hair and trying to summon the courage to face another day of impossible choices. Neither she nor Jonathan could have imagined that their vastly different struggles were about to intersect in ways that would transform both their lives. The next morning, Jonathan would make a phone call to Linda Morrison that would set in motion a chain of events neither of them could predict. And in Phoenix, Maria would walk into Golden Strands to sell her hair, unaware that her act of desperation was about to become someone else's opportunity for redemption. The universe, it seemed, had a way of connecting people who needed each other, even when they lived in completely different worlds and had no reason to believe their paths would ever cross. Jonathan fell asleep that night with an unfamiliar feeling stirring in his chest, not contentment or satisfaction, but something more fragile and more valuable, the possibility that his life could mean something beyond the accumulation of wealth and status. In Phoenix, Maria finally drifted off to sleep in her chair, still holding the bag of hair, dreaming of a future where her children would be safe and fed, unaware that across the desert, a man with the resources to change her life was beginning to understand that true wealth had nothing to do with bank accounts and everything to do with human connection. The stage was set for an encounter that would challenge everything both of them believed about worth, sacrifice, and the unexpected ways that compassion could bridge the gap between vastly different worlds. The morning sun cast harsh shadows through the windows of Golden Strands hair salon as Maria Rodriguez stood outside the upscale establishment, clutching the plastic bag containing 23 inches of her life. The salon sat in the heart of Scottsdale's fashion district, surrounded by boutiques and galleries that catered to clients. who spent more on a single shopping trip than Maria's family lived on for months. Through the glass door, she could see the interior, all polished. Chrome and white leather, with photographs of glamorous models wearing elaborate hairstyles that probably cost thousands of dollars to create. For a moment, Maria felt overwhelmed by the contrast between this world of luxury and her own desperate circumstances. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, thinking of Sophia, Miguel, Emma, and Lise sleeping peacefully when she'd left them with Mrs. Cheen next door. "It's just hair. It grows back." But even as she said the words, Maria knew they were a lie. Hair might grow back, but the woman who walked out of this salon wouldn't be the same person who walked in. Some transformations couldn't be undone, and some sacrifices left permanent marks on the soul. The bell above the door chimed as Maria entered, and immediately she felt out of place. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and makeup that could have graced a magazine cover, looked up from her appointment book with the practiced smile of someone trained to assess a customer's spending potential in seconds. "Good morning," the receptionist said, her tone polite but slightly questioning. "Do you have an appointment?" "I'm here about selling hair," Maria replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I spoke with someone yesterday about bringing in virgin hair for purchase." The receptionist's expression shifted, becoming more businesslike. "Oh yes, you must be here for Derek. He handles all our hair acquisitions. Let me get him for you." Derek Morrison turned out to be a man in his 40s with an eye for quality that came from years in the beauty industry. He examined Maria's hair with the clinical precision of a jeweler evaluating diamonds, running strands through his fingers and holding sections up to the light. "Beautiful texture," he murmured, more to himself than to Maria. "No chemical damage. Excellent thickness. Perfect color saturation. This is exactly what our high-end clients are looking for." Maria stood silently as Derek conducted his assessment, feeling strangely detached from the process. It was surreal to hear her hair described in commercial terms, reduced to market value and consumer demand. "I can offer you $1,200, Derek said finally. "Cash, as promised. But I need to cut it here, in our salon, to ensure proper handling and documentation. $1,200. The number should have brought relief, but instead Maria felt a hollow ache in her chest. Still, it was enough to pay the rent, restore their electricity, and buy groceries for the rest of the month. It was survival, even if it came at the cost of her identity. "Okay," she said quietly. "When can we do it?" "Right now if you'd like. I have a stylist available who specializes in hair donations and sales." 20 minutes later, Maria sat in a leather chair that probably cost more than her monthly rent, watching in the mirror as a stylist named Jessica prepared to cut away the last vestige of the woman she'd been before tragedy reshaped her life. "Are you sure about this?" Jessica asked gently, her scissors poised at the nape of Maria's neck. "Once it's gone, it's gone." Maria nodded, not trusting her voice. She thought of her children waking up hungry, of the eviction notice taped to their door, of all the impossible choices that had led her to this moment. The first cut was the hardest. The sound of the scissors closing through her hair seemed to echo in the pristine salon, and Maria watched in the mirror as the first long section fell to the floor. Jessica worked quickly and professionally, gathering each cut section carefully. To preserve its value, within 30 minutes it was over. Maria's reflection showed a stranger, a woman with a sharp bob that framed her face in an entirely different way. She looked older, more severe, but also somehow more determined. The woman in the mirror looked like someone who would do whatever was necessary to protect her family. Derek returned with an envelope containing $1,200 in cash, counting out the bills with practiced efficiency. "Pleasure doing business with you," he said, shaking Maria's hand. "If your hair grows back to this length and quality, please keep us in mind for future transactions." "Future transactions?" The phrase struck Maria as both hopeful and tragic. Hopeful because it implied a future. Tragic because it suggested this desperate measure might not be a one-time event. Maria left, golden strands with the cash tucked securely in her purse, and her head feeling strangely light without the weight of her long hair. The Arizona sun felt different against her newly exposed neck, and she found herself unconsciously reaching up to touch hair that was no longer there. Her first stop was the electric company, where she paid the reconnection fee and past due balance that would restore power to their apartment. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, processed the payment with professional efficiency. "You'll have power restored within 4 hours," the clerk said, handing Maria a receipt. Then, more quietly, she added, "I hope things get better. For you, honey, I can see you're doing your best." The unexpected kindness nearly brought Maria to tears. She managed a thank you and hurried out before her composure completely cracked. Next came the landlord's office, where she paid 3 months of back rent to Mr. Patterson, who seemed genuinely surprised to see her with the full amount in cash. "I have to ask, Maria," he said as he processed the payment, "where did this money come from? I don't want any trouble if this isn't legitimate." Maria touched her shortened hair unconsciously. "I sold something I owned, something valuable." Mr. Patterson nodded, perhaps understanding more than he said. "Well, this brings your account current. I'm glad you found a way to work things out." With the immediate crisis addressed, Maria drove to the grocery store with a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. $1,200 had seemed like a fortune when Derek had counted it out, but after paying the rent and utilities, she had less than $300 left for food, gas, and other necessities. Still, it was more than they'd had in weeks. Maria filled her cart with basics: rice, beans, pasta, ground beef, milk, eggs, fresh vegetables. For the first time in months, she didn't have to calculate the cost of every item or put things back because the total was climbing too high. At the checkout, the cashier, a young man who looked barely out of high school, made small talk as he scanned her items. "Getting a good start on the week's shopping," he said cheerfully. "Yes," Maria replied, watching the total climb to $127.43. A few months ago, that would have seemed like a reasonable grocery bill. Now it felt like a luxury. The drive home took her through neighborhoods that reflected Phoenix's economic diversity, from the upscale areas where she'd sold her hair to the working class. Communities where people like her struggled to make ends meet. She found herself noticing things she'd previously overlooked: the number of for rent signs, the check-cashing businesses and payday loan stores that proliferated in areas where people lived paycheck to paycheck, the contrast between the manicured lawns of affluent neighborhoods and the desert-adapted yards of those who couldn't afford excessive water bills. When Maria arrived home, she found Mrs. Chun on the front steps with the children, who had been waiting anxiously for their mother's return. Sophia was the first to notice the dramatic change in Maria's appearance. "Mama!" Sophia exclaimed, her 8-year-old eyes wide with surprise. "Your hair! What happened to your hair?" "I got a haircut, Mia," Maria said, kneeling down to hug her daughter. "Sometimes we need to try new things." Miguel, ever practical, at 5 years old, seemed less concerned with the aesthetic change than with its practical implications. "Does this mean we can have lunch today?" "Yes, baby," Maria said, her voice thick with emotion. "We can have lunch today." The twins, Emma and Lise, were too young to fully understand the significance of their mother's transformation, but they sensed the change in atmosphere. The desperate tension that had hung over their small apartment for weeks seemed to have lifted, replaced by something that felt almost like hope. That afternoon, as Maria prepared a real meal for her children, not the rice and beans that had been their staple for weeks, but actual ground beef with vegetables and fresh tortillas, she caught herself touching her shortened hair repeatedly. Each time, she was reminded of the choice she'd made and the price she'd paid for this temporary reprieve. But as she watched her children eat with the enthusiasm of kids who had been genuinely hungry, Maria knew she'd made the right decision. Hair was just hair, but her children's well-being was everything. What Maria didn't know was that her story was about to take an unexpected turn. 300 miles away, Jonathan Hayes was sitting in his Malibu office, dialing the number Dr. Martinez had given him for Linda Morrison, the caseworker who handled the hospital's most challenging family situations. "Linda Morrison speaking," came the voice on the other end of the line. "Ms. Morrison, this is Jonathan Hayes. Dr. Martinez suggested I contact you about your family assistance program. I'm interested in learning more about how I might help families in crisis." "Mr. Hayes." "Yes, Sarah mentioned you might call. I have to say, it's unusual to get calls from donors who want to get involved beyond writing checks. What specifically interests you about our family services?" Jonathan found himself struggling to articulate the restlessness and sense of purpose that had been growing in him. "I've been thinking about the difference between charity and actually helping people change their circumstances. I'd like to understand what real help looks like." Linda was quiet for a moment, perhaps assessing his sincerity. "Real help is complicated, Mr. Hayes. It's not just about money, though money certainly helps. It's about understanding that people in crisis need comprehensive support, housing, employment, childcare, medical care, sometimes just someone who believes in their ability to build a better life." "Could you give me an example?" "Well, I can't share specific details due to privacy concerns, but I can tell you that just this morning I got a call from a social worker in Phoenix about a single mother with 4 children. The woman is working. She's trying to do everything right, but she's caught in the cycle where every crisis depletes her resources and makes the next crisis more likely to be catastrophic." Jonathan felt something stir in his chest. What kind of help does someone like that need? "Everything," Linda said simply. "Stable housing she can afford, reliable childcare so she can work consistently, maybe job training for higher-paying employment, health insurance that actually covers her family's needs, and probably most importantly, time to build a foundation, instead of constantly putting out fires." As Jonathan ended the call, he found himself thinking about cycles, how wealth generated more wealth, but also how poverty seemed to generate more poverty. He'd been born into circumstances that made success almost inevitable, while others were born into circumstances that made mere survival a daily challenge. That evening, as Maria tucked her children into bed in their small apartment, now lit by electricity she'd bought with her hair, she couldn't have imagined that a wealthy stranger was lying awake in his Malibu mansion, thinking about how to break the cycles that trapped families like hers. The transaction at Golden Strands had been completed. Maria had traded her hair for temporary security, but the real transformation, for both her and Jonathan, was just beginning. Neither of them knew it yet, but their stories were about to intersect in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about wealth, sacrifice, and the unexpected connections that could bridge even the widest gaps between different worlds. 2 weeks after Maria sold her hair, she was back where she started, staring at an empty refrigerator and counting change to see if she could afford a gallon of milk. The $1,200 that had seemed like salvation had vanished with the ruthless efficiency of poverty's arithmetic. Rent, utilities, groceries, gas, Miguel's asthma medication, new shoes for Sophia whose toes were cramping in her outgrown sneakers. Every dollar had been claimed by necessity before it could provide any real security. But this time, Maria wasn't just facing financial crisis. She was facing something worse, the realization that her desperate sacrifice had bought them only temporary relief, and she had nothing left to sell. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Maria dropped the children at their various destinations, Sophia at school, Miguel at kindergarten, the twins at a subsidized daycare that cost almost as much as Maria made in tips some days. Then she drove to Sunrise Diner for another shift, serving coffee and eggs to customers who had no idea Their waitress was calculating whether she could afford to eat the leftover toast they left on their plates, 300 miles away in Malibu. Jonathan Hayes was experiencing his own morning revelation, though his came in the form of a phone call from Linda Morrison that would shatter his comfortable assumptions about how help actually worked. "Mr. Hayes," Linda's voice carried an urgency that immediately captured Jonathan's attention. "I know we discussed getting you involved with a family situation, and I think I have exactly the case that might open your eyes to what comprehensive help actually looks like." Jonathan had been standing on his terrace, drinking coffee that cost more per pound than some people spent on food in a week, watching the Pacific Ocean stretch endlessly toward the horizon. Linda's call pulled him back into the world where real problems required real solutions. "Tell me about it," he said, settling into one of his deck chairs. "It's that Phoenix case I mentioned, the single mother with 4 children. I've been working with the local social services, and the situation is becoming critical again. The woman made an extraordinary sacrifice a few weeks ago to address an immediate crisis, but she's caught in that impossible cycle we're solving. One problem just reveals 10 others." Linda's description painted a picture that haunted Jonathan long after the call ended. A mother who'd sold her hair, to keep her family housed and fed. Children who went to bed hungry, not because their mother didn't love them, but because love couldn't pay rent or fill empty stomachs. A woman working herself to exhaustion at a job that paid barely enough to survive, with no realistic path to anything better. What would it take to actually help her, Jonathan asked. Not just a one-time payment, but real help that changes her trajectory? Linda's response was both sobering and enlightening. Comprehensive help for a family like this costs money, but it's not just about money. She needs stable housing she can actually afford, not just this month, but long-term. She needs reliable childcare so she can work without worrying about her children's safety. She probably needs job training or education to qualify for better employment. And she needs time to build something sustainable instead of constantly reacting to the next crisis. How much time? How much money? To really change a family's trajectory? We're talking about a year or 2 of comprehensive support. Housing assistance, childcare, healthcare, maybe job training or education. For a family like this, you're looking at maybe $60,000 to $80,000 total, spread over 18 to 24 months. But here's the thing, that investment could break the cycle permanently. Instead of spending the next decade patching crisis after crisis, you could give them the foundation to build a stable life. Jonathan did the math automatically. $80,000 was less than he spent on luxury car maintenance annually. It was a rounding error in his investment portfolio. But for this family, it represented the difference between survival and security, between desperation and dignity. "I want to help this family specifically," Jonathan said. "What would that look like?" Linda was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Hayes, I have to ask, why this case? I work with hundreds of families in crisis. What makes this one special to you?" Jonathan found himself struggling to articulate the answer. There was something about the image of a mother selling her hair to feed her children that pierced through all his defenses against emotional involvement. It represented a level of sacrifice that his privileged life had never required him to understand, but also a kind of love that transcended material circumstances. "Maybe because it reminds me that desperation can coexist with dignity," he said. Finally, and maybe because I've never been required to sacrifice anything that actually mattered to me. That afternoon, while Maria was refilling coffee cups and calculating tips in Phoenix, Jonathan was on a private jet to Arizona, carrying briefcases full of legal documents and financial instruments that could transform a family's life. He'd spent the morning working with his attorneys and financial advisors to structure what they were calling comprehensive family assistance, a program that would provide housing, childcare, healthcare, education support, and living expenses. For the Rodriguez family, Maria transitioned to more sustainable employment, but Jonathan hadn't told Linda or anyone else about the additional element of his plan, something that had occurred to him as he'd listened to the details of Maria's situation. The Rodriguez family didn't just need temporary assistance. They needed permanent security, the kind of foundation that would ensure they never faced homelessness or hunger again. Jonathan's real estate empire included properties across the Southwest, including several residential developments in Arizona that had been designed but never built due to market conditions. One particular property, to 47 acres of high desert landscape 40 miles outside Phoenix, had been sitting undeveloped for 3 years, generating nothing but property tax bills. What if, instead of eventually developing it for wealthy buyers, he built something different? A working ranch designed for a family that had earned the right to security through their courage and resilience. The idea had seemed crazy when it first occurred to him, but the more Jonathan considered it, the more right it felt. Maria Rodriguez had sacrificed her hair to feed her children. What if someone with unlimited resources made a sacrifice in return, not money, which he had in abundance, but something more valuable, the chance to create permanent change in lives that deserved better than constant struggle? Linda Morrison met Jonathan at Sky Harbor Airport in Phoenix, her expression skeptical despite their previous conversations. She was a veteran social worker who'd seen too many wealthy people with good intentions and short attention spans to trust easily. "Mr. Hayes," she said as they drove toward the city, "I need to be completely honest with you. Most of the time when wealthy donors want to get personally involved with specific cases, it doesn't go well. There's usually a mismatch between expectations and reality, and the families end up feeling like charity cases rather than people deserving of dignity and respect." Jonathan nodded, understanding her concern. What would success look like in this case? Success would be Maria Rodriguez having genuine choices about her life for the first time since her husband died. Success would be her children growing up with security instead of chronic stress. Success would be breaking the generational cycle of poverty that traps so many families. They drove in silence through Phoenix's sprawling urban landscape, past the neighborhoods where people like Maria struggled to survive and toward the offices where decisions about their lives were made by strangers who'd never faced similar challenges. Meanwhile, Maria was finishing her shift at Sunrise Diner, counting tips that wouldn't be enough to cover the twins' daycare fees for the week. She'd been calculating and recalculating all day, trying to find some combination of expenses she could delay or eliminate to make their money last until her next paycheck. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days serving food to people who left more money on the table as tips than she sometimes had for her family's entire grocery budget. But she'd learned not to indulge in bitterness. It was a luxury she couldn't afford, and her children deserved better than a mother consumed by resentment. As Maria prepared to leave the diner, her manager, Tom Sullivan, approached her with an expression she couldn't read. "Maria, there's someone here who wants to speak with you. She says it's about family services, but she has someone with her, some kind of donor or something. They're in booth 12. Maria's stomach clenched. Visits from social services were never good news, especially when they involved strangers who might be evaluating her fitness as a parent. She smoothed her uniform, touched her shortened hair unconsciously, and walked toward booth 12 with as much dignity as she could muster. Linda Morrison stood as Maria approached, extending her hand with a professional smile. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm Linda Morrison from Family Services. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us." Maria shook the offered hand, then looked at the man who'd risen beside Linda. He was well dressed in a way that spoke of money and education, but his expression seemed genuinely respectful rather than condescending. "This is Jonathan Hayes," Linda continued. "He's interested in learning about family assistance programs. And I thought your situation might help him understand what comprehensive support actually looks like. Maria sat down slowly, her mind racing through possible implications. Am I in some kind of trouble? Are my children okay? Your children are fine, Linda assured her quickly. And you're not in trouble. Mr. Hayes is a philanthropist who's interested in supporting families in transition. We thought it might be helpful for all of us to have a conversation about what real help looks like. Jonathan had expected to feel awkward in this first meeting, but instead he found himself struck by Maria's quiet dignity. Even in her waitress uniform, exhausted from a day of service work, she carried herself with a strength that commanded respect. Mrs. Rodriguez, he said carefully, I understand you've been facing some significant challenges recently. I'm interested in learning about what would make a real difference for families in situations like yours. Maria studied his face, looking for signs of the condescension or pity she'd learned to expect from people who wanted to help. Instead, she saw something that surprised her, genuine curiosity and what might have been respect. What would make a real difference? She repeated, considering the question. Time, security, the chance to build something instead of always reacting to the next crisis. Can you be more specific? Maria thought about her children, about the sacrifices she'd made, and the ones she might still have to make. My children deserve to grow up knowing where their next meal is coming from. They deserve to have a mother who isn't constantly exhausted from working multiple jobs just to barely survive. They deserve a home that's actually theirs, not something they could lose the next time an unexpected expense comes up. Jonathan nodded, making mental notes. And what would it take to create that kind of security? More than I can ever provide. Working as a waitress, Maria said simply. But I'm not asking for handouts. I'm willing to work, to learn, to do whatever it takes. I just need the chance to build something sustainable instead of constantly putting out fires. The conversation that followed would later be remembered by all three participants as the moment when abstract concepts became concrete plans. Linda explained the comprehensive support programs that could help Maria transition to better employment. Jonathan asked detailed questions about costs, timelines, and outcomes. Maria shared her dreams and fears with a candor that surprised even her, but none of them could have predicted what Jonathan would say next. Mrs. Rodriguez, what if I told you that within 6 months, you could own your own home on your own land? With no mortgage payments and no rent? What if your children could grow up with space to run and play, with security that could never be taken away from them? Maria stared at him, certain she'd misunderstood. I'm sorry, what? I own land outside Phoenix, 47 acres of beautiful high desert. I've been planning to develop it, but I'd rather build something meaningful. A ranch house designed for your family, with space for the children to grow up safely, and maybe opportunities for you to build a business that could support you long term. The silence that followed was heavy with possibilities neither Linda nor Maria had imagined when they'd agreed to this meeting. Why? Maria asked finally. Why would you do that for strangers? Jonathan looked out the diner window at the Phoenix skyline, thinking about his father's words about wealth and meaning, about the empty luxury of his Malibu mansion, about the difference between charity and justice. Because you sold your hair to feed your children, he said simply. And because I've never been required to sacrifice anything that actually mattered to me. Maybe it's time I learned what that feels like. The conversation that would change multiple lives was just beginning, but already the trajectory of Maria's story was shifting from survival towards something none of them had dared to imagine. The possibility of genuine security built on mutual respect rather than charity. Outside the diner, Phoenix continued its daily rhythm, unaware that in booth 12, 3 strangers were designing a future that would challenge everything they thought they knew about wealth, sacrifice, and the unexpected ways that human connection could bridge even the widest gaps between different worlds. Maria Rodriguez stared at Jonathan Hayes across the diner table. certain she was hallucinating from exhaustion and stress. A stranger offering to build her family a ranch house. It sounded like something from a fairy tale, too impossible to be real. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," Maria said carefully, her waitress training keeping her voice steady even as her mind reeled. "I'm just a single mother trying to keep her kids fed and housed. I'm not. I don't need charity from rich people who feel sorry for me." Jonathan leaned forward, his expression earnest. "This isn't charity, Mrs. Rodriguez. This is an investment. In your family, in breaking cycles that shouldn't exist, in proving that comprehensive help actually works." Linda Morrison, who had orchestrated this meeting, found herself equally stunned by Jonathan's proposal. In 20 years of social work, she'd never encountered a donor willing to make such a massive personal commitment to a single family. "Mr. Hayes," Linda interjected, "perhaps we should discuss the practical aspects of what you're suggesting. Building a house is one thing, but there are legal considerations, ongoing costs, maintenance responsibilities." "All handled," Jonathan replied, pulling out his phone to show them architectural plans he'd had his team prepare during the flight from California. "I had my architects work up preliminary designs based on what you told me about the family's needs. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, open living spaces, a large kitchen, covered porches, solar panels for energy independence." Maria looked at the screen showing detailed floor plans and felt her world tilting. The house in the drawings was larger and more beautiful than anywhere she'd ever imagined living. But more than the size or luxury, what struck her was the thoughtfulness. Bedroom size for children, a homework station built into the kitchen island, a mudroom for storing school backpacks and sports equipment. "How do you know what my children need?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan smiled, and for the first time since entering the diner, he looked genuinely relaxed. "I asked Linda to tell me about your family. Sophia needs space to do homework without the twins interrupting. Miguel has asthma, so good air circulation and allergen-free materials are important. Emma and Louise are at the age where they need room to run and play safely. And you need a kitchen large enough to prepare real meals without feeling cramped." The attention to detail was overwhelming. Maria felt tears threatening and fought them back, not wanting to break down in front of strangers. But the idea that someone had thought carefully about her children's specific needs, rather than just offering generic assistance, touched something deep in her heart. "I still don't understand why," Maria said. "What do you get out of this?" Jonathan considered the question seriously. It was one he'd been asking himself during the flight to Phoenix. What did he get out of potentially spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on strangers? "I get the chance to find out if wealth can be used to create real change instead of just temporary relief," he said finally. "I get to learn what it feels like to make a sacrifice that actually matters. And maybe I get to help 4 children grow up with security instead of chronic stress." Linda had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement and concern. As a social worker, she'd seen too many well-intentioned interventions go wrong when the power dynamics weren't carefully managed. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Linda said, "this is an extraordinary offer, but I want to make sure you understand what's being proposed. Mr. Hayes is talking about building you a house on land he owns. That means you'd be living on his property, even if you owned the house itself. There would need to be clear legal agreements about ownership, responsibilities, and what happens if circumstances change." Maria nodded, appreciating Linda's advocacy. She'd learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true, because in her experience, they usually were. "What would you want in return?" Maria asked Jonathan directly. "Nobody gives away houses without expecting something back." "I want your children to have the chance to grow up with dignity and security," Jonathan replied. "I want you to have the time and space to build a sustainable future for your family. And I want to prove to myself that wealth can be used to break cycles instead of just perpetuating them." The conversation continued for another hour, with Linda asking practical questions about legal structures, Jonathan explaining his vision for the ranch property, and Maria trying to process the possibility that her family's story might be taking an unimaginable turn. Finally, Jonathan made a proposal that would test everyone's commitment to this unlikely partnership. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I understand this sounds impossible to believe. What if we started smaller? What if I arranged temporary housing for your family, a furnished rental home in a good school district, while the ranch house is being built? You could see how it feels to have security, without the constant stress of potential eviction. If it works for everyone involved, we move forward with the permanent solution. If not, no harm done." Maria looked at Linda, who nodded encouragingly. "It's a reasonable way to test whether this arrangement would work for everyone," Linda said. "And it gives you immediate relief from your housing crisis without committing to something you're not sure about." That evening, Maria drove home to her cramped apartment with her mind spinning from the day's revelations. She found Mrs. Chun watching the children, who were doing homework at the kitchen table under the apartment's harsh fluorescent lighting. "Mama!" Sophia called out as Maria entered. Miguel helped Emma with her coloring, and Luis only cried once during dinner. Maria hugged each of her children, breathing in their familiar scents and trying to imagine them living in the spacious house Jonathan had shown her in the architectural plans. Could it be real? Could their lives actually change so dramatically? "Mios," she said, gathering them around her on the small couch, "how would you feel about moving to a bigger house? Maybe somewhere with a yard where you could play outside?" The twins, at 3 years old, didn't fully grasp the concept, but Sophia's eyes went wide with excitement. "A real house? With my own bedroom? Maybe," Maria said carefully. "We'll see." That night, after the children were asleep, Maria sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and tried to process everything that had happened. 6 hours ago, she'd been calculating whether she could afford milk. Now, a stranger was offering to build her family a ranch house on 47 acres of Arizona desert. It was too much to believe, but it was also too much to dismiss. Meanwhile, Jonathan was in his hotel suite at the Four Seasons Scottsdale, video conferencing with his attorneys and construction managers. The preliminary plans for the Rodriguez ranch house were already being refined based on his meeting with Maria, and his legal team was drafting agreements that would give the family ownership of the house, while maintaining clear boundaries about the land use. "Jonathan," his attorney, David Patterson, said during the call, "I have to ask about your long-term thinking here. This is a substantial financial commitment to people you just met. What happens if the arrangement doesn't work out?" "Then I'll have learned something valuable about the difference between charity and justice," Jonathan replied. "And I'll still have helped 4 children live in a decent home for whatever period of time it lasts." His construction manager, Rebecca Torres, was more focused on practical considerations. "The site you've chosen is beautiful, but it's remote. We'll need to run utilities, drill a well, install a septic system. We're looking at 6 to 8 months of construction time, probably longer if we encounter unexpected conditions." "What about temporary housing in the meantime?" Jonathan asked. "I can arrange a rental property by next week," Rebecca said. "There's a nice 4-bedroom house in the Ahwatukee district, good schools, safe neighborhood, furnished and ready for immediate occupancy." As the video conference ended, Jonathan found himself thinking about his father's deathbed words about wealth and meaning. Richard Hayes had built an empire, but had wondered if it had any purpose beyond accumulation. Jonathan was about to find out if inherited wealth could be transformed into something more meaningful. The next morning brought a phone call that would test everyone's resolve. Linda Morrison called Maria with news from the Social Services Review that had been pending since Janet Mill's visit weeks earlier. "Maria, I have both good news and challenging news," Linda said. "The good news is that the review board has seen the improvements in your situation. the stable housing payments, the children's improved school attendance, the fact that you've addressed the immediate crisis issues. They're not recommending any action at this time. And the challenging news? They want to see sustained stability over the next 6 months. If there are any more crisis situations, missed rent, utility shutoffs, extended periods where the children are unsupervised, they'll revisit the case with a different lens. Maria felt her stomach drop. 6 months of sustained stability seemed impossible on her waitress income, especially now that the hair money was gone. But maybe, if Jonathan's offer was genuine, she wouldn't have to face that challenge alone. That afternoon, Maria met Jonathan and Linda at the temporary rental house in Ahwatukee. As they walked through the 4-bedroom home with its modern kitchen, spacious living areas, and small backyard, Maria felt like she was touring someone else's life. "This is yours for as long as you need it," Jonathan said, handing her the keys. "No rent, no deposits, utilities included. The only requirement is that your children are happy and healthy." Sophia, who had been allowed to come along to see the house, ran from room to room with excitement. "Mama, look! I can have my own desk for homework, and Emma and Lise can have their own room." Watching her daughter's joy, Maria felt the last of her resistance crumble. Whatever Jonathan's motivations, whatever risks this arrangement might involve, her children deserved the chance to live without constant stress about housing and food security. "Okay," she said quietly, "we'll try it." The move happened over the next weekend, with Jonathan arranging professional movers to transport the Rodriguez family's modest possessions to their new home. As Maria watched her children explore their new bedrooms and play in an actual backyard for the first time in their lives, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Carlos's death: hope. But the real test of this unlikely partnership was still to come. Building trust between people from such different worlds would require patience, understanding, and a willingness to be vulnerable in ways none of them had anticipated. As the sun set over the Sonoran Desert, casting golden light through the windows of their temporary home, Maria tucked her children into beds that were truly theirs for the first time in months. And for the first time since she'd cut her hair in that dark bathroom, she allowed herself to believe that their story might have a happy ending after all. The transformation had begun, but the most challenging parts of their journey together lay ahead. Building a house was one thing. Building a relationship across the vast gulf of their different experiences would prove to be far more complex and far more rewarding than any of them had imagined. 3 months into their new living arrangement, Maria Rodriguez found herself facing a crisis she'd never expected: the discomfort of genuine stability. For so long, her identity had been built around surviving the next emergency, making impossible choices, and sacrificing pieces of herself to keep her family afloat. Now, as she stood in the modern kitchen of their temporary home, watching her children eat breakfast without worrying about the cost of each bite, she felt simultaneously grateful and unmored that the transformation in her children had been remarkable. Sophia was thriving in her new school, joining the art club and bringing home drawings that she proudly displayed on the refrigerator. Miguel's asthma had improved dramatically in the cleaner air and less stressful environment. The twins, Emma and Lise, were sleeping through the night for the first time in months. Their small bodies finally relaxed enough to rest deeply, but with stability came unexpected challenges. Maria had always defined herself as a fighter, someone who would do whatever it took to protect her children. Now that the immediate threats were gone, she found herself questioning who she was when survival wasn't the primary concern. The morning that would test the foundation of their arrangement began with a phone call from Rebecca Torres, Jonathan's construction manager, who had news about the ranch house project. "Maria, we've run into some complications with the well drilling," Rebecca explained over the phone. "The geological survey shows we need to go deeper than expected, and we've hit some regulatory issues with the county about septic systems for the size house we're planning." Maria felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. In her old life, complications meant disasters, setbacks that could unravel everything she'd worked to build. What does that mean for the timeline? She asked, gripping the phone tighter then. Necessary. We're looking at probably another 4 to 6 months of delays. The house will be better for the extra time. We can install a more sophisticated water filtration system and upgrade the septic to handle future expansion. But I know you were hoping to be in your permanent home by Christmas. After hanging up, Maria sat at the kitchen table and tried to process this news rationally. The delay didn't threaten their immediate security. Jonathan had made it clear that the temporary housing was theirs for as long as needed. But the old patterns of thinking were hard to break, and Maria's mind immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios. What if Jonathan got tired of the delays and expenses? What if he decided this project was more complicated than he'd bargained for? What if he was already regretting his impulsive offer to help strangers? These fears were still swirling in Maria's mind when Sophia returned from school that afternoon with news that would complicate their story in ways none of them had anticipated. "Mama," Sophia said, settling at the kitchen table with her homework. "Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you can come to the parent-teacher conference next week. She says I'm doing really well, but she has some questions about my family situation." Maria's blood ran cold. Parent-teacher conferences were routine, but questions about family situations were not. In her experience, when school officials started asking questions, it usually meant someone had concerns about a child's welfare. "What kind of questions?" Maria asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "I don't know. But Jessica Miller told everyone that her mom heard that we're living in this house because some rich man is paying for everything. She asked if you're his girlfriend or something." The innocent question from an 8-year-old hit Maria like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on the practical aspects of Jonathan's help that she hadn't considered how their arrangement might look to outsiders. A single mother suddenly living in an upscale neighborhood with no apparent means to afford such housing, supported by a wealthy man she barely knew. It was the kind of situation that generated gossip and suspicion. That evening, after the children were in bed, Maria called Linda Morrison to discuss her concerns. Linda had become more than just a social worker. She'd evolved into a trusted advisor who understood both the benefits and complications of their unusual arrangement. "I was wondering when this would come up," Linda said when Maria explained the situation. "Unconventional family arrangements always attract attention, especially in communities where people are used to more traditional situations. What do I tell Sophia's teacher? What do I tell my children when they ask why we're different from other families?" Linda was quiet for a moment, considering her response. "You tell them the truth, that sometimes people help each other in ways that don't fit neat categories. That Jonathan saw a family in need and had the resources to help. That accepting help with dignity is different from being dependent on charity. But what if the school reports this to social services? What if they think there's something inappropriate about our arrangement? Then we document everything properly," Linda said firmly. "We have legal agreements, financial records, evidence of the children's improved welfare. Most importantly, we have the truth that this is a legitimate arrangement, designed to help a family achieve stability." The conversation with Linda helped calm Maria's immediate fears, but it also highlighted the complexity of their situation. They weren't just building a house on the desert. They were constructing a new kind of family arrangement that didn't fit conventional definitions of either charity or independence. Meanwhile, Jonathan was dealing with his own complications. His decision to personally invest in the Rodriguez family had generated significant attention within his social and business circles. Not all of it positive. His business partner, Michael Chun, had requested a meeting to discuss concerns about Jonathan's personal projects and their potential impact on the company's reputation. "Jonathan, I support your philanthropic interests," Michael said as they sat in the conference room of Hayes Development Corporation. But this Rodriguez situation is becoming a liability. We have investors asking questions about your judgment. Clients wondering if you're making emotional decisions instead of business decisions. Jonathan had expected this conversation, but it still irritated him. Since when do our investors and clients have opinions about how I spend my personal money? Since you started making those personal decisions in ways that affect public perception of the company. The real estate community is small, and word gets around. People are saying you're either having some kind of midlife crisis or that there's more to this relationship with the Rodriguez woman than you're admitting. The suggestion that his help for Maria was motivated by anything other than genuine concern for her family's welfare struck Jonathan as both insulting and revealing. It said more about the assumptions of his social circle than about his actual motivations. "Let me be very clear," Jonathan said, his voice carrying an edge that Michael had rarely heard. "My relationship with the Rodriguez family is exactly what I've said it is, an attempt to use wealth constructively to help a deserving family achieve stability. If our investors and clients find that threatening, maybe we need different investors and clients." The meeting ended with tension that would have ongoing implications for Jonathan's business relationships, but it also clarified something important for him. His commitment to Maria's family wasn't just about helping them. It was about proving to himself and others that wealth could be used for purposes beyond accumulation and status. The crisis that would test everyone's resolve came the following week, when Sophia's parent-teacher conference triggered a chain of events that threatened to unravel everything they'd built. Mrs. Patterson, Sophia's teacher, was a well-meaning woman who had noticed dramatic improvements in Sophia's academic performance and social engagement since the family's move to Ahwatukee. However, she was also concerned about rumors regarding the family's living situation. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Mrs. Patterson said as they sat in the small conference room, "Sophia is doing beautifully in school. Her grades have improved, she's more confident, and she seems much happier. But I have to ask about your current housing situation." Maria had prepared for this question, but it still made her nervous. "We're living in temporary housing while our permanent home is being built. It's been arranged through a family assistance program." "I see. And this assistance program, is it through the county or a private organization?" The questions continued for another 20 minutes, with Mrs. Patterson probing gently but persistently about the details of their arrangement. Maria answered as honestly as she could while respecting the privacy of everyone involved. 2 days later, Maria received a phone call that confirmed her worst fears. Janet Mills, the social worker who had initially reviewed their case, was requesting a home visit to assess the family's current situation. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I want to be clear that this isn't a punitive review," Janet explained. "But we've received some inquiries about your family's living arrangements, and I need to document that everything is appropriate and in the children's best interests." Maria's hands were shaking as she hung up the phone. Despite Linda's assurances and the legal protections Jonathan had put in place, she felt the familiar terror of potentially losing her children to a system that didn't understand their situation. That evening, she called Jonathan with news of the impending social services review. His response surprised her with its immediate intensity. "Absolutely not," Jonathan said firmly. "This is harassment, not legitimate oversight. I'm calling my attorneys immediately." "Jonathan, please don't make this worse," Maria pleaded. "I can't afford to look like I'm trying to hide something or avoid review. I need to cooperate with social services to protect my children." The conversation that followed revealed the depth of Jonathan's investment in their family's welfare, but also the potential for their different backgrounds to create misunderstandings about how to handle challenges. "Maria, you don't understand how these systems work," Jonathan said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to having problems solved by expensive lawyers. "Social services only has power if you let them. With proper legal representation, we can shut this down before it becomes a problem. "No," Maria said quietly but firmly. "You don't understand how these systems work for people like me. I can't fight social services with lawyers and money. I have to prove that I'm a good mother by cooperating, by being transparent, by showing that my children are safe and happy." The disagreement highlighted a fundamental difference in their approaches to challenges. Jonathan's instinct was to use his resources to overcome obstacles. Maria's instinct was to work within systems while maintaining her dignity and protecting her children. The resolution came from an unexpected source. Linda Morrison, who had been monitoring the situation, proposed a solution that honored both perspectives. "What if we arrange for the social services review to be conducted jointly with a family success evaluation?" Linda suggested during a three-way conference call. "Instead of treating this as a potential problem investigation, we present it as documentation of a successful family assistance program." The idea was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than fighting the review or submitting to it defensively, they would use it as an opportunity to demonstrate the positive outcomes of their arrangement. The review, conducted the following week, became a validation of everything they'd built together. Janet Mills toured their temporary home, interviewed the children, and documented the dramatic improvements in their health, education, and emotional well-being. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Janet said as she concluded her evaluation, "I want you to know that this is exactly what successful family assistance looks like. Your children are thriving, you're engaged and responsive as a parent, and you've created a stable, nurturing environment for your family." As Janet left, Maria felt a profound sense of relief, but also something more complex. She'd passed the test, but the experience had revealed how precarious their security still was, how dependent they remained on the acceptance and understanding of others. That evening, as she tucked her children into bed in their comfortable bedrooms, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. They'd gained so much: safety, stability, hope for the future. But they'd also entered a more complex world where their choices and arrangements were subject to scrutiny and judgment in ways they'd never experienced before. The house on the Mayam Desert was still months away from completion, but Maria was beginning to understand that building a new life was about more than constructing walls and installing plumbing. It was about creating a foundation strong enough to withstand the unexpected challenges that came with stepping outside conventional definitions of family, charity, and independence. And as she turned off the lights and headed to her own room, Maria smiled at the sound of her children's peaceful breathing, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them from a position of strength rather than desperation. 6 months after moving into the temporary house, Maria Rodriguez stood at the edge of what would become her family's permanent home, watching construction crews frame the walls that would shelter her children for years to come. The desert landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the skeletal structure rising from the red earth, like a promise being kept one board at a time. But the view that should have filled her with hope instead stirred a complex mixture of gratitude and unease. The house taking shape before her was beautiful, more beautiful than anything she'd ever imagined calling home. But it was also a daily reminder of how much her family's future depended on the continued goodwill of a man she was still learning to understand. Jonathan Hayes stood beside her, consulting with Rebecca Torres about window placement and solar panel installation, his enthusiasm for the project evident in every gesture. Over the past months, he'd thrown himself into the construction process with an intensity that surprised everyone, including himself. He'd spent more time in Phoenix than in Malibu, living in extended-stay hotels and visiting the construction site daily. The kitchen island should be positioned to allow sight lines to the living room, Jonathan was explaining to Rebecca, so Maria can prepare meals while supervising homework and family time. Maria appreciated his attention to her family's needs. But the conversation also highlighted something that had been troubling her for weeks. Jonathan knew intimate details about her children's routines, their personalities, their needs. He'd earned that knowledge through months of genuine involvement in their lives, but the dynamic still felt unbalanced in ways that made Maria uncomfortable. "Jonathan," she interrupted gently, "could I talk with you privately for a moment?" They walked away from the construction noise toward a cluster of Joshua trees that marked the edge of the building site. In the desert silence, surrounded by the vast Arizona landscape, Maria tried to find words for feelings she'd been struggling to understand. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest," she began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Why are you really doing this?" Jonathan looked genuinely surprised by the question. "I've told you why. Because I want to help your family achieve security and stability. That's what you tell Linda and the lawyers and the construction crew," Maria replied. "But I'm asking why you personally have invested so much of yourself in our lives. You don't just write checks and walk away. You're here almost every day. You know my children's favorite foods. You remember Sophia's art projects and Miguel's asthma medications. That's not normal wealthy person charity behavior." The question forced Jonathan to confront motivations he'd been avoiding examining too closely. The truth was more complex and more personal than the philanthropic explanations he'd been offering. "Maybe because helping your family has given my life more meaning than anything I've done in the past 10 years, he admitted finally. "Maybe because watching your children thrive has made me understand what my father meant about the difference between wealth and purpose." Maria nodded, appreciating his honesty, but also recognizing the potential problems it created. "Jonathan, I'm grateful for everything you've done, more grateful than I can ever express. But I need you to understand something. My children can't become substitutes for the family you never had. And I can't become responsible for giving your life meaning." The conversation that followed was difficult for both of them, touching on issues of dependency, gratitude, and the complex dynamics that developed when people from vastly different worlds tried to build meaningful relationships. "I'm not trying to replace anything," Jonathan said, his voice defensive. "I'm trying to help people who deserve better than the circumstances they were born into." "And I appreciate that," Maria replied. "But help that comes with unspoken expectations isn't really help. It's another kind of dependency. I need to know that this house, this land, this security for my children isn't going to disappear if you get bored, or if we don't meet whatever emotional needs you're hoping we'll fill." The confrontation was necessary but painful, forcing both of them to examine the foundation of their arrangement more honestly than either had been willing to do before. Meanwhile, the children were experiencing their own complications as they adjusted to their new reality. Sophia, now 9 years old and thriving academically, had begun asking questions about their situation that Maria found difficult to answer. "Why does Mr. Jonathan spend more time with us than with his own family?" Sophia asked one evening as they prepared for bed in the temporary house. "He doesn't have children of his own," Maria explained, trying to keep her answer simple and age-appropriate. "But why doesn't he? And why did he choose us to help instead of other families?" The questions reflected a 9-year-old's natural curiosity, but they also revealed the complexity of explaining their arrangement to children who needed to understand their place in the world. How do you tell a child that their security depends on the continued generosity of a stranger? How do you help them appreciate extraordinary help while still developing normal confidence and independence? Miguel, at 6 years old, had developed a different relationship with Jonathan, one that concerned Maria for entirely different reasons. The boy had begun looking to Jonathan for approval and guidance in ways that felt too much like son seeking father figure. "Mr. Jonathan says I'm getting really good at reading," Miguel announced one afternoon, showing off a book Jonathan had brought him. "He says maybe I can be an engineer like the people who designed our house." Maria loved seeing Miguel's confidence grow, but she was troubled by how much the boy's self-worth had become tied to Jonathan's attention and approval. What would happen to Miguel's sense of himself if Jonathan's involvement in their lives diminished? The crisis that would test the durability of their arrangement came from an unexpected source, Jonathan's family. 7 months into the project, Jonathan received a visit from his cousin David Hayes, a partner in the family real estate empire who'd been watching Jonathan's Phoenix project with growing concern. "Jonathan, I think it's time we had a frank conversation about what you're doing down here," David said as they toured the construction site together. "This has gone far beyond charity. You're personally involved with this family in ways that could create serious problems." "What kind of problems?" Jonathan asked, though he suspected he knew where this conversation was heading. "Legal problems, for starters. If something goes wrong, if the mother makes accusations about your relationship, if there are questions about your motivations, you could be facing lawsuits that would destroy your reputation and potentially the company." David's concerns weren't entirely unfounded. Jonathan's deep personal involvement with the Rodriguez family had indeed created potential vulnerabilities that his lawyers had been quietly trying to address. "Beyond that," David continued, "you're setting a precedent that could be disastrous for the family business. Every sob story, every family in need, every charity case in the country is going to expect the Hayes family to solve their problems personally." The conversation continued for hours, with David presenting a series of arguments about risk management, public perception, and family business obligations. His conclusion was clear. Jonathan needed to step back from personal involvement with the Rodriguez family and transition his support to a more conventional charitable structure. Fund a foundation, make regular donations, even pay for the house to be completed, David suggested. "But stop living like these people are your responsibility. It's not healthy for you, and it's not sustainable for them." That evening, Jonathan faced a decision that would define not just his relationship with Maria's family, but his understanding of what it meant to use wealth meaningfully. The conversation with David had forced him to confront questions he'd been avoiding. Was his involvement with the Rodriguez family genuine help, or was it an attempt to fill emotional voids in his own life? Was he empowering Maria and her children, or creating dependencies that could ultimately harm them? Meanwhile, Maria was dealing with her own family crisis. Her sister Elena had called from California with news that would complicate their situation in unexpected ways. "Maria, I have something to tell you, and I don't know how you're going to react," Elena said during their nightly phone call. "David finally found work, good work, with benefits and steady pay. We're getting back on our feet financially." Maria felt genuinely happy for her sister's family, but Elena's next words would challenge everything about their current arrangement. "The thing is, we want you and the kids to come stay with us. David's company has a good benefits package that would cover health insurance for all of you. The cost of living is lower here than in Phoenix, and you could probably find work that pays better than the diner." The offer represented something Maria had dreamed of since Carlos's death, the chance to be near family, to have built-in support systems, to raise her children surrounded by people who love them unconditionally. But it also represented a fundamental challenge to the path she'd chosen with Jonathan's help. The house in the desert was nearly finished. The children were thriving in their schools. They'd built routines and relationships in Phoenix that had given them stability for the first time since Carlos's death. "Elena, I don't know what to say," Maria replied honestly. 6 months ago, I would have said yes immediately, but things are complicated now." "Complicated how?" "Because of the rich guy who's building you a house." The blunt question forced Maria to examine her own motivations and attachments. How much of her reluctance to leave Phoenix was about the children's welfare, and how much was about her own comfort with their current situation? "It's not just about Jonathan," Maria said, though even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were entirely true. "The kids are settled here. Sophia is doing amazing in school. Miguel's asthma is under control. The twins are thriving. I can't just uproot them again." "But you could give them something better than dependence on charity," Elena replied gently. You could give them family. The conversation ended without resolution, but it had introduced a new variable into an already complex equation. For the first time since accepting Jonathan's help, Maria found herself considering whether their arrangement, however generous, was truly the best option for her children's long-term welfare. That night, as she tucked her children into bed, Maria looked around their comfortable temporary home and tried to imagine explaining to them that they might be leaving all of this behind for yet another fresh start in another new place. The house in the desert was nearly finished, its walls rising steadily toward completion. But the human foundations of their arrangement were proving more fragile than anyone had anticipated. Both Maria and Jonathan were about to discover that building trust and understanding across the vast differences in their backgrounds would require more than good intentions and generous resources. It would require honest conversations about dependency and independence, about gratitude and self-determination, about the difference between helping and controlling. The choices they made in the coming weeks would determine not just whether the house got finished, but whether the relationships they'd built could survive the completion of the project that had brought them together. As construction crews prepared to install the roof that would finally shelter the Rodriguez family permanently, both Maria and Jonathan were learning that some foundations were more difficult to build than others, and that the most important structures in any meaningful relationship were the ones that couldn't be blueprinted or constructed. They had to be carefully negotiated, one honest conversation at a time. The morning that would determine the future of two families dawned clear and bright over the Arizona desert, with the finished Rodriguez ranch house standing like a monument to the possibility of transformation. After 9 months of construction delays, legal complications, and emotional turbulence, the 3,200 square foot home was finally ready for occupancy. Maria Rodriguez stood in the empty living room, sunlight streaming through windows that had been positioned to frame the desert sunrise, and felt the weight of a decision that would affect not just her own life, but the lives of her 4 children who had already endured more upheaval than any child should experience. The house was everything Jonathan Hayes had promised and more. The kitchen island was positioned perfectly for homework supervision. The children's bedrooms were spacious and filled with natural light. The master suite included a reading nook where Maria could retreat when she needed solitude. Solar panels would ensure energy independence, the well-provided clean water, and the septic system was designed to handle a family twice their size. But standing in this beautiful empty house, Maria felt more conflicted than ever about the path that had brought them here. 3 days earlier, she'd had the conversation with Jonathan that had been building for months, the honest discussion about boundaries, expectations, and the sustainability of their arrangement. The talk had been difficult, but necessary, clearing the air about motivations and dependencies that had been troubling both of them. "Jonathan," she'd said as they sat on the front porch of the temporary house, watching her children play in the backyard, "I need to know that this house comes with no strings attached. That if I decide to take the kids to California to be near Elena's family, you won't feel betrayed or cheated. That if the children grow up and choose their own paths without considering your feelings, you won't withdraw your support out of hurt." Jonathan had been quiet for a long time before responding. "I need to know that if I step back and give you the space to be truly independent, you won't shut me out completely. That after everything we've built together, there's still room for friendship, even if it's not needed for survival." The conversation had led to a series of meetings with Linda Morrison, legal consultations, and frank discussions about restructuring their arrangement to protect everyone's interests while honoring the genuine care that had developed between them. The solution they'd developed was elegant in its simplicity. The house and 5 acres of surrounding land would be deeded directly to Maria, with no mortgage, no conditions, and no obligations. Jonathan would establish a modest trust fund for the children's education, managed by an independent trustee. Beyond that, Their relationship would be based on choice rather than necessity, but knowing that the arrangement was legally sound and emotionally healthy didn't make the decision easier for Maria. Moving to California meant leaving behind the security they'd built, the community connections the children had formed, and the friendship with Jonathan that had become important to all of them. The choice became more complicated when Elena arrived from California for a week-long visit, bringing her husband David and their 2 children to meet the family they'd been supporting from afar. "Maria, this house is incredible," Elena said as they toured the completed ranch home together. "I had no idea how beautiful it was going to be. The children must be so excited to finally move in." But Elena's visit also allowed her to see firsthand how much the Rodriguez family had changed during their time in Phoenix. Sofia had become confident and articulate, speaking passionately about her school's art program and the friends she'd made. Miguel's health had improved dramatically in the desert climate, and he'd developed interests in astronomy and engineering that were being nurtured by excellent teachers. The twins were thriving in their preschool program, speaking in complete sentences and showing none of the behavioral issues that had worried Maria during their most difficult months. More significantly, Elena could see how the children had come to view Jonathan as a permanent fixture in their lives. He wasn't a father figure exactly, but he was something unprecedented in their experience, a reliable adult who cared about their welfare without being obligated to do so by blood or marriage. "Uncle Jonathan promised to teach me to identify desert plants," Miguel announced during dinner on Elena's 3rd day in Phoenix. "And he's going to help me build a telescope so I can see the stars better from our new house." Elena looked at her nephew with a mixture of happiness and concern. The boy was clearly thriving, but his attachment to Jonathan was also obvious and potentially problematic if the relationship wasn't sustainable. That evening, after the children were in bed, Elena and Maria had the conversation that would crystallize Maria's thinking about their future. "I can see why you're conflicted," Elena said as they sat on the porch of the temporary house, desert stars brilliant in the unpolluted sky above them. "The kids are obviously doing well here, and Jonathan seems genuinely committed to your family's welfare, but," Maria prompted, hearing the reservation in her sister's voice. "But this isn't normal. Maria, good people don't usually give away houses and land to strangers without expecting something in return. And even if Jonathan's motivations are pure, what happens when he gets married, has children of his own, or decides he's done enough for your family?" The questions Elena raised were ones Maria had been wrestling with for months. The legal protections were in place, but emotional attachments were more fragile than property deeds. "What if I'm making a mistake either way?" Maria asked. "What if I stay here and the kids become too dependent on Jonathan's approval? What if I leave and they lose opportunities they could have had here?" "There's no perfect choice," Elena replied gently. "But there's something to be said for being near family who love you unconditionally, even if we can't offer the same material advantages." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car in the driveway. Jonathan had returned from a business trip to Los Angeles, and through the window they could see him unloading gifts for the children. Books for Sofia, a model rocket kit for Miguel, art supplies for the twins. "He really cares about them," Elena observed, watching Jonathan carefully balance multiple packages while trying not to wake the children with his arrival. "That's what makes this so difficult," Maria replied. "It would be easier if he was just a wealthy man writing checks. But he's become part of their lives in ways that matter. The decision that would shape their future came from an unexpected source, the children themselves." 2 days before Elena was scheduled to return to California, Sofia asked to speak with her mother privately. At 9 years old, Sofia had developed a maturity beyond her years, shaped by the family's struggles and recovery. "Mama," Sofia said as they walked together through the desert landscape around the nearly completed house, "are we going to move to California with Aunt Elena?" Maria was surprised by the directness of the question. Would you want to? Sophia considered the question seriously. I would like to be near Aunt Elena and our cousins. But I don't want to leave Mr. Jonathan behind. And I don't want to leave my friends at school, or my art teacher, or our house. What if I told you that Mr. Jonathan will always be your friend, even if we move away? That he cares about you and Miguel and the twins no matter where you live? But it wouldn't be the same, Sophia replied with the devastating honesty of childhood. And besides, Miguel says this is where Papa's spirit is, in the desert where he can watch over us. The conversation revealed that the children had been processing their situation with more sophistication than Maria had realized. They understood that their relationship with Jonathan was unusual but valuable. They'd formed attachments to place and community that couldn't be easily transferred. And they'd created their own narrative about their father's presence that was tied to the Arizona landscape. That evening, Maria made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She called a family meeting that included Elena, David, Jonathan, and Linda Morrison. The children were allowed to participate, sitting quietly while the adults discussed their future. I've been thinking about this decision as choosing between two options, Maria began. California with family support, or Arizona with Jonathan's help, but I realized I was thinking about it wrong. She paused, looking around the room at all the people who cared about her family's welfare. The real choice isn't between different types of help. It's about what kind of foundation I want to build for my children's future. And I think the strongest foundation is one that includes all of you. The plan Maria proposed was more complex than anyone had anticipated, but it honored the relationships and attachments that had developed over the past year. The family would stay in Arizona, moving into the ranch house and establishing it as their permanent home. But they would also maintain strong connections with Elena's family in California, with regular visits and potentially summers spent together. Jonathan would remain involved in their lives, but within clear boundaries that protected everyone's autonomy and emotional health. Most importantly, Maria would begin the process of becoming truly independent. She'd been accepted into a nursing program at Arizona State University, funded partly by scholarships and partly by savings from the stable housing situation Jonathan had provided. The program would take 3 years to complete, but would qualify her for employment that could fully support her family. I want my children to grow up knowing that security comes from multiple sources, Maria explained to the assembled group. Family love, community support, personal achievement, and yes, sometimes the kindness of friends who care about our welfare. But I also want them to know that ultimately, their security comes from their own strength and capabilities. Jonathan listened to Maria's plan with a mixture of pride and humility. She was proposing exactly what he'd hoped for, but hadn't known how to achieve. A path toward independence that didn't require severing the relationships that had become meaningful to everyone involved. There's one more thing, Maria said, looking directly at Jonathan. I want you to know that what you've done for my family goes far beyond the house and the land. You've shown my children that good people exist in the world, that help can come from unexpected sources, and that wealth can be used to lift others up rather than just accumulate more wealth. The conversation continued for hours, working out practical details and emotional boundaries, but the fundamental decisions had been made. The Rodriguez family would stay in Arizona, but they would do so as independent people who chose their relationships rather than depending on them for survival. 6 months later, Maria Rodriguez stood in the kitchen of her ranch house, preparing dinner for her children and their guest, Elena, who was visiting for Sophia's 10th birthday. Through the window, she could see Miguel and his cousins working on a telescope project with Jonathan, who had driven down from his Phoenix office for the birthday celebration. Maria's hair had grown back, not to its original length, but to a comfortable shoulder-length style that framed her face and reflected the woman she'd become, stronger, more confident and more complex than the desperate mother who'd sold her hair in a Scottsdale salon 2 years earlier. She was halfway through her nursing program, earning grades that qualified her for academic scholarships and work-study positions. The children were thriving academically and socially, with Sophia winning regional art competitions and Miguel developing into a serious student of astronomy and mathematics. But perhaps most importantly, the relationships that had been built through crisis had evolved into something sustainable and healthy. Jonathan remained involved in their lives, but as a chosen family friend rather than a necessary benefactor. Elena's family visited regularly, providing the children with cousins and extended family connections. Linda Morrison had become a trusted advisor who helped Maria navigate the complexities of higher education and career planning. As Maria watched her children play in the desert sunset, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of security and possibility. The sacrifice of her hair had been just the beginning, the first step in a transformation that had required courage, humility, and faith from everyone involved. The ranch house stood solid and permanent against the Arizona landscape, its solar panels gleaming in the evening light, its walls sheltering a family that had learned to build security from multiple sources. But the real foundation of their stability wasn't made of concrete and steel. It was made of relationships based on mutual respect, clear boundaries, and the understanding that true help empowers people to help themselves. That night, as Maria tucked her children into beds that were truly their own, in a house that would always be their sanctuary, she thought about the woman who had stood in a dark bathroom 2 years earlier, preparing to cut away the last vestige of her former identity. That woman had been brave enough to sacrifice her hair to feed her children. But it had taken even more courage to accept help with dignity, to build relationships across vast differences in background and resources, and to create a foundation for her children's future that honored both their need for security and their capacity for independence. The desert night was filled with the sound of wind through the Joshua trees and the distant calls of coyotes. But inside the ranch house, 4 children slept peacefully, their dreams filled with possibilities that had seemed impossible when their mother first heard the scissors close through her hair in that upscale Scottsdale salon. Sometimes the most extraordinary transformations began with the most ordinary acts of love. And sometimes, when desperation met compassion, when sacrifice met generosity, when different worlds collided with mutual respect, the result was something none of the participants could have imagined at the beginning: a new kind of family, built not on blood or obligation, but on the choice to care for each other's welfare across all the boundaries that typically divided people. The story that had begun with a mother's desperate sacrifice had become something larger, a testament to the possibility that wealth and poverty, privilege and struggle, could meet in ways that transformed everyone involved. And in the end, the most valuable thing Maria Rodriguez had gained wasn't the house or the land or the financial security, but the knowledge that her children would grow up understanding that help could come from unexpected sources, that kindness existed in the world, and that their own capacity for strength and resilience was the most reliable foundation for whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. The scratching sounds of desperation had been replaced by the solid foundation of hope, built one relationship, one conversation, one act of mutual respect at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.